I think it's time we talk about the Cleveland Browns, because they sit at 9-5 with almost all their key players missing time this year. And I haven't really seen anyone necessarily talk about this Browns team to great detail, so I decided I would do it myself. So in today's video, I want to do a couple of things. Number one, I want to talk about what's going on for this Cleveland Browns team this year. I want to talk about their pros and cons of their roster, and I want to talk about the future of this team. We're going to be doing that plus some more, so let's just go ahead and hop right into it. Now, to start off this video, I think it would be extremely unfair for me to not talk about the injuries that this team has had, because to be honest with you guys, despite the fact that I make NFL content and listen and watch NFL content all day, I didn't even know they had this many injuries. I looked at their injury report and I looked at their depth chart, and I was just shocked and blown away with the amount of injuries this team has, mainly on the offensive side of things. Some key guys who are missing time this season is, of course, Deshaun Watson, Nick Chubb, Jakeem Grant, Jedrick Wills, Dawson Deaton, Drew Forbes, Jack Conklin, DeJuan Jones, and then on the defensive side of things, you have guys like Ogbo Okoronkwo, Maurice Hurst, Anthony Walker, Grant Delpit, Juan Thornhill, and Rodney McLeod. Now granted, some of those guys are just backups or not really relevant players, but 90% of those guys are really damn important. Deshaun Watson, starting quarterback, Nick Chubb, starting running back, Jedrick Wills and Jack Conklin, your starting tackles, Maurice Hurst is one of your starting defensive tackles, Grant Delpit is starting safety, Rodney McLeod a depth chart safety. These are all a bunch of stars and notable players on this roster who are missing time and at this point in the season probably not going to play at all. And these are major positions: the quarterback position, your tackle spots, your running back spot, your safety, your interior defensive tackle spot. It's not like you're losing a long snapper. No disrespect to my long snappers, I was a long snapper in high school myself. But yet, despite everything that I just mentioned, they are 9-5, second in their division, and going to make the playoffs. And I think a lot of credit needs to go to two players: their head coach Kevin Stefanski and Jim Schwartz, the defensive coordinator, because those guys have done a remarkable job of working through injuries and still having competent units on both offense and defense. Sure, your offense isn't incredible, but even with Deshaun Watson, it wasn't going to be incredible anyways because, let's be honest, Deshaun Watson kind of sucks. But now you have Joe Flacco as your starting quarterback, and you're still a pretty competent unit. Offensively, they rank 12th in points per game, 17th in yards per game, and 22nd in touchdowns per game. They really do struggle on third downs. They currently have the 30th worst third down conversion rates. But again, to kind of repeat some points, you had Deshaun Watson, Dorian Thompson-Robinson, PJ Walker, and Joe Flacco as your four starting quarterbacks this year. So I would imagine that your offense isn't going to be incredible, yet despite that, they actually still put up some points. But the key for this team, their defense. And sure, the defense can be a little bit inconsistent, especially when they have big games against some really good teams, but defensively, they rank pretty high in almost every category. They rank 12th in opponents' points per game, they rank number 1 in opponents' yards per game, they rank number 2 in opponents' yards per play, they rank 19th in opponents' touchdowns per game, and they rank exceptionally well in the passing department. The secondary is extremely stingy. They get interceptions, they play great coverage, they force quarterbacks to make tight window throws, and that not only shows on the field, but it shows out in their statistics as well. Defensively, this secondary ranks number 1 in opponent completion percentage, number 2 in opponents' yards per pass, number 1 in opponents' yards per games, and number 3 in opponents' interception thrown ratio. And going back to that opponent pass yards per game, they only give up 158.9 yards per game. Let me repeat that and say it a little bit louder: 158.9 yards per game. And that's missing Rodney McLeod, Grant Delpit, and Denzel Ward missing some games. You have to give a ton of credit to Jim Schwartz for what he's been able to do despite the injuries this team is currently going through. And it's hard to talk about this defense without talking about that defensive line. You have Myles Garrett, who is by far one of the best players in the entire NFL. He is currently in the race for Defensive Player of the Year for a reason. You also have Dalvin Tomlinson and Zadarius Smith, who are both great additions for this defense. Those guys have a sack rate of 9.03, which is the 4th highest in the NFL. That's some impressive stuff for a defense. Now, if there was one fall for this defense, and I think it's kind of a small fall, I still think this is a very good unit, but if there was one issue for this unit, I would say it would probably be the linebacker spot. Sione Takitaki is a very quality player, but I don't think he's that quality player that is just going to go out there and be a Fred Warner level guy. Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah can be very inconsistent at times. Usually he plays pretty good, especially in pass coverage, but I would like to see him be a little bit more dominant in run stuffs. And Anthony Walker just cannot stay healthy to save his life. With that being said, they typically play pretty well, and of course when you have a great defensive line and a great secondary, it makes your job a ton easier. I'll talk a little bit more about that linebacker position here in just a little bit when I talk about their future, but for now, that's kind of my little synopsis of the defense. Let's go back to the offense real quick. You guys obviously heard the stats earlier. This offense has played pretty decent given the fact they have all these injuries, and Joe Flacco is doing a very good job for what he's been given. He's not really forcing turnovers. I know he had like a 3 interception game earlier, but for the most part he's been pretty safe with the ball. He's giving his playmakers, guys like Elijah Moore and Amari Cooper, tons of opportunities, And we're really seeing David Njoku take that next step to become one of the best tight ends in the entire NFL. Not many people are talking about this, but David Njoku is having a career season right now. The one fallback for this offense is, of course, their quarterback position isn't elite, and their two tackles are just really bad. Again, we're talking about a unit that had Jedrick Wills, Jack Conklin, and was supposed to be a developmental guy in DeJuan Jones, who was forced in the starting position and played pretty decent, but now you have Jerron Christian and James Hudson III, and I don't know, guys, those are just not it. It also doesn't help when you have guys like Joel Bitonio fighting injuries constantly either. So while their interior offensive line is freaking phenomenal, their two tackles really bring the unit down. And of course, those might be the two most important positions along the offensive line. Those are where you're facing your Micah Parsons, your Nick Bosa's, your Joey Bosa's, and your Myles Garrett's. And for those to be your two weak spots on your offense makes things very difficult. I sort of wonder if maybe potentially you decide to move one of your guards out to tackle some games, although it might be a little too late in the season to start doing that. The next big downfall for this team is they don't really have a third receiver. On the year, Cedric Tillman only has 15 catches for 160 yards. And when you look at who's behind them, you have Marquise Goodwin, David Bell, and James Proche. And I'm just sorry, they're just not that good. So you're relying on Amari Cooper and Elijah Moore to really do a lot of special things, and for a defense, you can usually just double team Amari Cooper and just make them force feed Elijah Moore a ton. Because even though Elijah Moore is one of their better receivers, he's still nothing special. And that's partially why David Njoku's having such a great season. He's getting a ton of the targets and a ton of the action. And for this team moving forward, it's going to have to be continuing to feed guys like Amari Cooper, Jerome Ford, and David Njoku. Again, you have to give a ton of credit to Kevin Stefanski for keeping this team together despite all the injuries. So with that being said, let's go ahead and quickly cover my pros and cons of this current roster. You guys can probably understand what I'm going to talk about here because I've already kind of mentioned it, but you get my point. The pros for this team: their defense, their head coach, their defensive coordinator, David Njoku and these weapons, the O-line, mainly the interior guys, their culture, and their secondary. The cons for this team are their quarterback play, the Nick Chubb injury, receiver 3, the tackle position, and just in totality, their health. And another thing that not a lot of people are talking about, they're really good at home, but really bad in away games. On the year, they have a 7-1 record at home, whereas they have a 2-4 record away. And what's weird about that 2-4 record is that their 2 wins are against Baltimore and Indianapolis. Obviously, Baltimore is going to win the division more than likely, and Indianapolis looks like they're going to be a playoff team too. Their 4 losses are against the Pittsburgh Steelers in Week 2, the Seattle Seahawks in Week 8, the Denver Broncos in Week 12, and the Los Angeles Rams in Week 13. Obviously, those away games are all pretty difficult. Pittsburgh in Week 2 was still kind of put together. Obviously, Seattle, Denver, and the Los Angeles Rams look like a pretty competently built team now. But Indianapolis and Baltimore, of the 6 teams, are arguably the 2 best ones. So I wouldn't say this team necessarily has an away game problem. Granted, they have to kind of fix that and fine-tune that if they are going to make the playoffs. Because as I said earlier, more than likely Baltimore is going to win the division, so if a team like the Cleveland Browns wants to make a deep run, they're going to have to do a lot of it in the away games. So I do think it is an issue, but I don't think it's such a big issue that we seriously have to talk about it for the next 10 minutes. So to end this video off, I want to do 2 things. I want to talk about their immediate future, and I want to talk about their long-term future. When you look at the rest of their regular season, they have games against the Houston Texans, the New York Jets, and the Cincinnati Bengals. Houston is obviously without CJ Stroud this week. They're also missing a ton of other weapons, so I do think a team like the Cleveland Browns should be able to win that one. If you win that one, that's your 10th win of the season. Then you have the New York Jets, who are obviously probably going to start Zach Wilson. That is actually a Thursday night game, so again, I expect the Browns to win that one. What I will say about that game though, even despite the fact that's not going to be a very entertaining game, if you are looking for the further implications of how this game could detail the rest of their season, watch that Browns offense versus that very good Jets defense. Because while the Browns defensively are going to dominate a guy in Zach Wilson, if they can dominate that New York Jets defense, that will show me a lot about this offense's potential, especially come playoff time. And then to end the season off, you have the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, I don't really know how much implication that game is actually going to have, but assuming that the Browns do decide to play all their starters and the Bengals also decide to play their starters, that could be another pretty interesting matchup. That is, of course, the Bengals without Joe Burrow, so it's going to be pretty interesting to see how that game goes out. There's a very good chance this team ends off with 12 wins this year, assuming they win their last 3. Now, if you want to say they lose to the Cincinnati Bengals or the New York Jets, that's fine. You still end the season off 11-6, but I think they could win all 3 of those games, so I'm just going to say 12-5. Now, if we look at the playoffs, we're just going to assume that every single team holds their current place. I am going to make one small substitute. I do think the Bills are going to find a way to make the playoffs, so I am going to sneak the Bills in at the number 7 seed. So for the wild card weekend, you'd have the Browns versus the Jaguars, you'd have the Chiefs versus the Bengals, and then you have the Bills versus the Dolphins. For the Browns, I actually kind of think you'd be favored against a team like the Jacksonville Jaguars, because despite the fact the Jaguars are well coached and have so much talent, the Browns are just freaking awesome. And if Joe Flacco can just play a competent game within the playoffs, I think that's an easy W for the Browns, because Jacksonville defensively has some serious weaknesses in the secondary, whereas the Browns on the defensive side of things are very dominant. So I think the Browns defense is going to step up and kind of shut out that Jaguars offense. Now, if we assume that the Bills beat the Dolphins, which would have the number 7 seed go up against the Ravens, and we assume the Chiefs are to beat the Colts, you'd have a matchup between the Browns and the Chiefs. And we already know how well documented the downfall of the Chiefs has been this year. Their receiving core sucks. And if you want to know more about how I feel about this Chiefs team, at the very end of this video, I'll have my video on the Chiefs pinned up at the very end, so make sure to check that one out after this one. And again, I kind of think the Browns have a clear advantage over the Chiefs. But here's the thing about the Chiefs. They have a really good defense. One of their best players is Chris Jones, who just so happens to be an interior defensive lineman. Now, I do understand that he does sometimes go out there and play on the defensive end side of things, but let's just hypothetically say he stays on the defensive interior side of things. I do think that is a good thing for the Browns because obviously the strength of the Browns offensive line is their interior. Of course, you have guys like George Karlaftis who are absolutely going to smoke those tackles, but at that point in the season, the Browns have already known this and probably have a whole game plan set out for that. Defensively speaking, I think the Browns will absolutely destroy that Patrick Mahomes-led offense because they have everything defensively that the Chiefs don't have offensively. The Chiefs have bad tackles, the Browns have great edge rushers. The Chiefs have no receivers, the Browns have great corners. Now, I don't think this game is going to be a blowout. I definitely do think this could be an extremely low-scoring affair, but if we're going to speak to the hypothetical, let's just say the Browns win this one to make it a little bit more fun. Then they'd be going up against the winner of the Buffalo Bills versus the Baltimore Ravens game, which I think that could be a very fun game in and out of itself. I'm just going to make a fat assumption and say the Baltimore Ravens are going to win that one, which for the Cleveland Browns actually kind of bodes well for them. Obviously, these guys are very well aware of what these other teams do. Of course, they're in the same division, so they play each other twice every single year. The Ravens won the first matchup in dominant fashion. Of course, that was before a lot of these injuries happened, but then the Browns beat them in week 10, 33-31. So it's a 1-1 series split, and going into the playoffs, that kind of bodes well for the Browns. Now, to be honest with you guys, I think the Ravens would win that game, but hypothetically speaking, I could see the Browns also winning. So there you go. That's kind of the path for the Cleveland Browns. Obviously, I'm just projecting everything that might happen and kind of giving you possible matchups for what the Browns might face in the playoffs. But given the fact they have all these injuries, just for the Browns to be in the dance, to be in the playoffs, that's pretty damn impressive. And then let's go ahead and look at their upcoming offseason. I think the big keys for what they need to do is surround Deshaun Watson with more stars, mainly a receiver 2 and possible receiver 3. The next thing is going to be retaining your key players, guys like Zadarius Smith, Dalvin Tomlinson, those guys who might be on 1 or 2 year deals. Find ways to give them longer term extensions. And next, make a decision on Nick Chubb. Is he your future, or do you need to find a permanent replacement? But that is going to be the end of this video. If you guys did enjoy the video, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button. And Cleveland Browns fans, you guys tell me, did I get everything right, or did I miss a couple things? And if I did, let me know in the comment section below, and I'll make sure to respond. But I love you guys. Peace.